In that crowded room, with microphones set and eyes watching every move, Elon Musk sat with his usual air of confidence, almost restless in the way he adjusted himself. Like a man too accustomed to being in control of every conversation, Jasmine Crockett had barely opened her notes, her voice steady and deliberate, when Musk cut in for the first time. It wasn't a long interjection, just a sharp phrase meant to dismantle her opening. He had built a reputation for challenging, for interrupting, for forcing his presence into the center of every exchange, and that day he leaned heavily on that habit. The interruption was jarring enough that some people in the audience turned their heads as if wondering whether the session was going to collapse into chaos before it even began. Crockett did not flinch. She let him finish, then picked up exactly where she had left off. For her, this wasn't about matching his energy, but about holding her ground. Yet Musk wasn't finished. The second interruption followed almost instantly, like an echo, as if he wanted to make it clear that her words weren't going to flow uninterrupted. He questioned figures, dismissed her framing, and injected his own narrative into the space she was carving. His tone was confident, but underneath it was the unmistakable sign of someone unwilling to let another perspective take the floor for long. The third interruption confirmed what everyone was beginning to realize. Musk wasn't engaging in dialogue. He was taking over the stage. He wasn't waiting for her to finish her points. He was dissecting them before they were fully formed, pressing his influence in a way that was both calculated and instinctual. Crockett, meanwhile, refused to be rattled. She leaned into her words, never raising her voice, never letting his volume define the atmosphere. That contrast became its own silent commentary, one person trying to dominate through sheer presence, and the other through persistence. By the fourth interruption, the rhythm of the exchange had shifted entirely. It was no longer a straightforward discussion. It was Musk versus Crockett, and the audience was keeping count without even meaning to. Every time he leaned in, every time he cut across her voice, the tally grew, and so did the whispers around the room. People were no longer focused on the content but on the pattern. Musk was determined to prove her wrong, yet in doing so, he was proving something else entirely: that he couldn't bear to let her words stand unchallenged for more than a moment. The fifth time was sharper than the rest, edged with frustration. It was the kind of interruption that carried a hint of impatience, as though he was tired of her resilience, tired of her insistence on moving forward despite his resistance. Crockett let the moment hang for a second longer this time, glancing down at her notes and back up again, as if to remind the room she wasn't going anywhere. It was subtle, but effective. She gave him the space to speak without ceding her ground. The sixth interruption almost blended into the fifth. A rolling wave of resistance that seemed less about the details she presented, and more about cutting the flow. Musk wasn't necessarily dismantling her facts anymore. He was blocking momentum. His voice carried authority, his reputation as an innovator and businessman behind him, and yet the way he used that authority revealed how uneasy he was with simply letting her present uninterrupted. It was as though the act of her continuing was itself a challenge to him. By the seventh interruption, the dynamic was undeniable. Musk was no longer just participating in a heated exchange, he was making it a spectacle. His words overlapped hers, and his interruptions drew attention from the crowd, some of whom now sat leaning forward, waiting to see how long she would endure it. But Crockett had been building a quiet strength across every break, every attempt to silence her. She had refused to be shaken, refused to trade in his sharpness for her own, and while Musk kept interrupting, something else was building under the surface. A growing awareness among the audience that he was overstepping, that the interruptions themselves were becoming the story. In those 7 breaks, Musk had tried to own the narrative, to dismantle her authority before it could even fully form. But what stood out wasn't his dominance. It was her refusal to bow to it. She continued to speak, point after point, as though his interruptions were nothing more than noise to be filtered out. He had interrupted her 7 times, and yet she still stood steady, her words still reaching the room. Jasmine Crockett had faced interruptions before, but the kind Elon Musk delivered that day carried a different weight. He came at her arguments with the energy of someone who wasn't used to being told no, someone who had built empires on the confidence of his own voice. Each time he cut across her, there was the expectation that she might crack, falter, or at the very least, match him in aggression. But Crockett chose another path. Her composure became her strategy, and it was visible in the smallest gestures, the steady rhythm of her breathing, the way her hands rested calmly on her notes, the refusal to speed up or slow down her words no matter how loudly Musk spoke. It was almost as if she had decided before the first word left her mouth that she would not play by his tempo. Musk thrived on speed, on disruption, on momentum that kept others off balance. She countered with control, with pauses that didn't belong to him, with a cadence that seemed immune to interruption. When he pressed forward with the force of his personality, she anchored herself deeper into hers, and the room began to notice. By the third time he tried to wedge himself into her argument, Crockett's face remained unchanged. No eye rolls, no raised voice, no sarcastic remarks, just the steady insistence that she had come prepared to speak, and speak she would. Musk leaned into his authority, but she leaned into her patience. It was the kind of patience that isn't passive but active, the kind that makes silence an act of defiance. Every time he broke in, she allowed just enough space for him to finish, then resumed with her words intact, almost as though she had rehearsed the exact spot where she would rejoin her sentence. There was power in the contrast. Musk's interruptions grew more animated, his tone sometimes edged with disbelief, other times sharp with insistence. He was trying to wrestle control, to bend the moment toward himself. But Crockett's refusal to mirror that intensity only made his approach seem louder, harsher, even unnecessary. Her calmness became a mirror reflecting back his impatience, and the audience, without realizing it, began to measure the scene through her restraint rather than his dominance. Observers who expected her to collapse under the weight of his presence found themselves watching something else unfold. The more he tried to throw her off balance, the more deliberate she became in her pacing. It wasn't about ignoring him, she heard every word, every challenge, but she refused to let his interruptions dictate her delivery. It was like watching two different worlds collide, Musk operating as he always had, fueled by quick reactions and blunt force, and Crockett anchoring herself in steadiness, forcing the room to feel the difference. When the fifth interruption came, sharper than the rest, Crockett simply adjusted her papers, glanced briefly at him, and then back at her notes as though he had not shifted the air around them. It wasn't defiance in the traditional sense. It was something subtler, something that placed the burden of his behavior squarely on him. She didn't need to call it out for the audience to see it. Each time she held her composure, the interruptions stood out more starkly, not less. Musk had always been quick on his feet, using words like weapons, but his efforts here landed differently. Against someone who refused to rise to the bait, the sharpness lost some of its edge. The room wasn't hearing her being drowned out. They were hearing her resilience echo each time she reclaimed her words. By the seventh time, people were leaning in, not to see whether Musk could silence her, but to see how she would continue. And continue, she did. The composure that she carried wasn't just a tactic, it was a message. She was showing that interruptions, no matter how many, couldn't undo preparation, couldn't erase conviction, couldn't derail someone who had already decided their words mattered. Musk interrupted, but Crockett's refusal to match his tempo meant she always got her points out, steady and unbroken. The interruptions became his story. Her composure became hers. Her persistence wasn't loud, and it wasn't dramatic. It was measured, deliberate, and unshaken. That was the piece Musk couldn't dislodge, no matter how many times he cut across her words. It was this refusal to play his game that turned the moment into something larger than just an exchange. It became a picture of two approaches, colliding, one loud, one steady, and the steady one holding the line. When Jasmine Crockett finally reached her 8th point, the air in the room shifted in a way no one could ignore. Elon Musk had already broken in 7 times, carving across her sentences, insisting on being the center of gravity in the conversation. But Crockett had carried each interruption with patience, waiting for the right moment. And when it arrived, she didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice or push her words out quickly. Instead, she delivered them with the kind of clarity that comes only from preparation and certainty. The 8th point wasn't an offhand remark, or a defensive retort, it was a fact. She had been building to one grounded so firmly in Musk's own record that it was impossible for him to dodge. She spoke about accountability, about contradictions in his statements, and tied them directly to actions he had taken. Her words landed with a weight that needed no extra force. They weren't wrapped in anger, they were wrapped in truth. That difference made them resonate even more. Musk, who had been so quick to jump in before, stayed quiet for the first few seconds. His body leaned forward slightly, his lips parted as if preparing to cut her off again. But no words came. It wasn't hesitation in the ordinary sense, it was the sudden realization that she had struck, at a point he couldn't dismiss with quick rhetoric. The confidence that usually carried his interruptions found no footing here. The audience noticed immediately. Some leaned back, surprised by the silence. Others leaned forward, as if waiting for Musk to mount the rebuttal they had seen him give countless times. But instead, the pause stretched longer, and Crockett's words filled the room without resistance. For the first time, there was no overlap, no raised voice chasing hers. It was her moment, and it rang out clearly. What made the 8th point so powerful wasn't just its accuracy, it was the timing. Musk had set himself up across 7 interruptions, creating a rhythm where everyone expected him to cut her off again. By waiting, Crockett built tension. By speaking calmly, she disarmed that tension, and by delivering a statement that left no easy escape, she broke the pattern he had been forcing all along. The silence that followed wasn't just his silence, it was the sound of his strategy collapsing. People in the room began exchanging looks, as though asking one another if they had just witnessed Musk being cornered in real time. For someone who thrived on controlling the flow, his stillness became louder than any interruption he had made earlier. It wasn't that he suddenly respected her words, it was that he had nothing immediate to counter them with, and the gap revealed more than any speech could. Crockett didn't press the silence. She didn't gloat, didn't point it out. She simply continued. letting the power of that moment stand for itself. It was restraint on her part, and it made the impact stronger. Musk's silence had given her words an unplanned amplification, and she used it not by filling the room with more force, but by carrying on as though this was exactly how it was supposed to unfold. Asterisk for Musk. The silence was a rare moment of being disarmed. His interruptions had been his weapons, and without them, his presence felt different. The audience saw it too. The way dominance can turn into exposure when the rhythm breaks. Crockett had found the one point where interruption would not work, and by speaking it calmly, she left him with no clear path forward. Asterisk the silence lingered longer than anyone expected. It wasn't dramatic in the sense of shouting or confrontation. It was dramatic in its absence of noise. Musk had built an identity around being quick, forceful, and unrelenting. But the eighth point reminded everyone that dominance can falter when met with unshakable precision. The moment wasn't about volume, it was about a fact, so rooted in reality that even the loudest voice could not smother it. Asterisk Crockett's words, steady and exact, continued to ripple in that silence, and Musk, for once, had to sit with them. The silence that followed Jasmine Crockett's eighth point carried more weight than all 7 interruptions combined. Elon Musk, who had made his presence felt at every turn, sat still, caught between his instinct to push back and the awareness that anything he said at that moment could unravel further. It was rare to see him motionless in debate, rare to watch him measure his words instead of releasing them in quick succession. For the audience, the shift was unmistakable. This was not the Musk they were used to, the one who always had a reply, who always reclaimed the floor. Asterisk Crockett didn't highlight his silence. She simply pressed forward, steady and precise. Each word she spoke now echoed differently, no longer competing against interruptions but carried by the absence of them. The balance in the room had changed. People who had been leaning into Musk's energy now leaned into hers. What had started as an exchange dominated by his attempts to overtake her became a space where her persistence defined the flow. Asterisk Musk's dominance had been clear in the beginning 7 interruptions, each sharper than the last, each designed to derail and unsettle. But in the end, it was Crockett's persistence that remained. She had refused to mirror his aggression, refused to let his rhythm dictate hers. Instead, she used consistency as her shield. And when the 8th point landed, it revealed something no interruption could cover. The silence exposed the imbalance between his attempts to dominate and her refusal to yield. Asterisk for Musk. Silence had never been his language. His influence had always thrived on being vocal, on inserting himself, on using words as tools to shape the narrative. But here, his pause became a kind of surrender, not intentional, not public, but undeniable to those who witnessed it. In that moment he was no longer the disruptor but the one disrupted, not by louder opposition, but by a calm endurance that left no room for his usual tactics. Asterisk the audience felt the rare reversal. They had come expecting sparks, maybe even conflict, but what they witnessed was something subtler, more telling. They saw that dominance can falter not through a louder voice, but through patience. They saw Musk silenced not by force, but by the weight of an argument that couldn't be brushed aside. For Crockett, persistence had become power, and for Musk, silence had become a reflection of limitation. Asterisk the 7th interruption had seemed like the climax, the peak of his attempts to drown her out, yet it was what followed the refusal to stop, the continuation into the 8th point that revealed where the true strength lay. Crockett had shown that persistence is not just about continuing to speak, but about speaking with intent, even when interrupted repeatedly. She didn't allow the interruptions to shape her message. She allowed her message to stand above them. Asterisk what remained most shocking was the contrast. Musk had been loud, cutting, forceful, but in the end, it was his quiet that stood out. Crockett had been calm, deliberate, consistent, and in the end, it was that very consistency that allowed her to silence him without raising her voice. The silence wasn't just a pause, it was a statement. One Musk himself hadn't chosen but had been forced into. Asterisk. That moment crystallized a rare image. The man known for filling every space with words, brought to stillness by someone who never once lost composure. The interruptions had been his method of control, but the silence became her victory. Persistence outlasted dominance. And for those watching, it was a reminder that even the loudest voices can falter when faced with unshakable steadiness. Asterisk Crockett kept going, her tone unchanged, her pace steady. Musk listened, perhaps unwillingly, perhaps searching for a way back in, but the silence that had held him in place lingered in the minds of everyone there. It was proof that sometimes the most powerful moment isn't in speaking, but in realizing there is nothing left to say. As the session wound down, the room carried a very different energy than it had at the start. What began with Elon Musk pushing himself into the center of every exchange, ended with a silence that had reshaped the balance. People had seen him challenge, interrupt, and push, but they had also seen Jasmine Crockett endure, respond, and ultimately command the space with a single well-timed point. The contrast lingered even after their words had finished. Asterisk. Observers knew they had witnessed something that didn't happen often. Musk was a figure who lived in motion, who built his influence on speed, disruption, and sheer force of personality. Crockett had not matched him blow for blow. She had refused that arena entirely. Instead, she chose patience, precision, and persistence. And it was that decision which left the lasting mark. The interruptions, loud as they had been, dissolved into the background. The silence, heavy and undeniable, became the moment everyone remembered. Asterisk, it wasn't simply about one exchange between two people. It was about what the moment revealed, that dominance built on constant interruption is fragile when met with quiet resilience. Musk's strength had always been his ability to control tempo, to insert himself where others faltered. But Crockett showed that refusing to lose composure is its own form of strength, one that can turn even the loudest figure into a listener. Asterisk for those in the room. The story became less about policy or politics, and more about a shift in dynamic. It was a reminder that power isn't always about volume, nor is it about who speaks the most. Sometimes, power belongs to the one who stays grounded while everything else tries to shake them. Crockett had done exactly that, and in doing so, she forced a silence from Musk that carried more weight than any argument he might have made. Asterisk. When the cameras stopped flashing and the murmurs began to fade, the memory remained clear. Musk, uncharacteristically quiet, and Crockett, unwavering in her delivery. The moment illustrated that persistence and composure are not just defensive tools, they are decisive ones. And once the silence had passed, it was impossible to ignore what it meant. Asterisk in the end, Musk had interrupted 7 times. He had tried to command, to redirect, to dominate. But it was the 8th point, calmly delivered, that shifted everything. Crockett didn't just continue speaking, she showed that patience can outlast pressure, and that sometimes the greatest victory is not in shouting louder, but in being unshakable long enough for the other side to run out of noise. Asterisk, that was the takeaway people carried with them, the sound of silence, the weight of persistence, and the unexpected sight of Elon Musk brought to stillness by someone who never let